Three? Okay. Welcome to Almost Road Podcast. This is Almodor Jr., your host, and we have my friend Arjuna Das. Arjuna, can you introduce yourself?
So I live in New Zealand. I was born in Auckland, moved to Canada when I was 8. I lived there for 11 years and moved back to New Zealand at age 19. Growing up, I got into Christianity at about 11, quite seriously. I was praying every day. When I was 16, I started to find it philosophically unsatisfying. So I became somewhat eclectic. So I still always believed in God, but I didn't think that any one religion had a comprehensive theology that I could take shelter of. So I just sort of took good ideas where I found them. And then when I moved back to New Zealand at the age of 21, I met the Hare Krishnas, and I heard Dave Swami give this class, and the philosophy made complete sense to me. Kept hearing more classes, started reading the books, and took up the process of Krishna Consciousness. Since doing that, I've been living in Auckland. Got married 7 years ago to my lovely wife, and we have 2 children. One of them's age 1 and the other one's age 4, 2 boys. And I work as an electrician doing commercial maintenance, which is quite cushy work because I basically, most of the work is changing light bulbs in air-conditioned office buildings. And that allows me to be able to listen to lectures and audiobooks and seminars basically all day long while I'm at work. So I listen to a lot of stuff, Hare Krishna lectures. So I heard the philosophy quite well, listen to audiobooks, and then lately I've been studying economics because I'm trying to figure out how to invest so that I can protect my wealth with the economy looking like it's falling apart. And
Okay, and I'm interested in what problems did you find in Christianity, and what was in Christian consciousness or being in Hare Krishna that made up your mind?
To be honest, I can't remember all the details of what it was that made me disillusioned when I was 16, but I can tell you where I see it having shortcomings now. So in Krishna Consciousness, it's a really detailed theology. Like Prabhupada, who's the founder of the Hare Krishna movement in the West, he would say that, we can tell you practically God's phone number. There's so many details given in Bhagavatam about God. His looks are described, what he does with his free time is described, his intimate associates are described, and there's a process given to connect with him. And also the Bhagavatam mentions about other religions. So it doesn't mention all of them, but it mentions a few, like Buddhism and some of the other religious beliefs that you find in India are mentioned. And it's described a purpose, why they exist, how they serve a purpose. And then it's said that Buddha came because the people on the time in India were being really sinful and they were doing all these animal sacrifices, but they weren't doing them properly. It's a bit mystical, but supposedly an animal sacrifice done properly, the animal goes into the fire and comes out with a new body. So there's not actually any violence committed, but they weren't doing it properly and they were committing violence to animals. So Buddha came and said, just get rid of all these Vedas, get rid of all these rituals, and just be compassionate. Don't cause suffering to other living entities. So it reduced the caliber of the theological teachings, but for a higher purpose of getting the basic principles inculcated. And then Sankaracharya came and gave a more comprehensive. He gave a bait and switch. He brought the Vedas back in, but kind of kept the same principles. And then later, other acharyas came and brought back in monotheism, like Madhvacharya and Ramanujacharya. So in Christianity, there's no real explanation of why other religions exist. Like I was having a discussion on Facebook with one Christian in the Capturing Christianity Facebook discussion group, because I posted my video and he was saying, "Oh, but the differences matter." I was like, "Well, what are the differences?" And he said, "Well, for one, Muslims don't accept Jesus." I was like, "Well, that's a detail." He's like, "Well, who gets to decide what a detail is?" I'm like, "Okay, well, if God cares about a theological detail, like whether you accept Jesus or not, then he's a bureaucrat who cares more about, who isn't so interested in the quality of your character as much as he cares about whether you filled in the form correctly. Because, you could be dedicating your whole life to serving God and sharing the message about God with other people, but just happen to be doing it in a religion other than Christianity. And according to some Christians, you'd be going to hell because you didn't accept Jesus. And to me, if God is actually like that, then that's incompatible with the idea that God's all loving, because that kind of paints God as a bureaucrat or even a tyrant. Like if my children mispronounce my name, I don't really care. I know what they want, especially with a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, they can't pronounce things properly. So you just figure out what they want and give it to them. So I figure an all-loving God, and according to the theology of Krishna consciousness, it's like that. Attaining mercy from God isn't like some kind of vending machine where you push all the right buttons and bang, you get the mercy. It's actually God's a person, and he interacts with us on a personal level, responding to the nuances and our motivations and our desires and our shortcomings, and accounting for those things and reciprocating accordingly. So the vending machine analogy, you could like do everything correctly externally, but actually have an attitude which is really off, and then God's going to respond to that. And the other issue with Christianity is they don't accept reincarnation, and without that, there's a lot of things you can't explain. You get two problems. One is you can't really explain the problem of evil. Like philosophically, you can have skeptical theism, like, well, God could have a good reason for, giving babies cancer. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't actually explain why this kid has cancer, not another kid. And whereas with reincarnation and karma, you can say, well, that kid, it's not an excuse to not have compassion for somebody when they're suffering. That's a misapplication of it. But it's a philosophical answer, not an emotional answer. It's not what you tell somebody's parents whose kid has cancer. It's a philosophical thing. But from a philosophical point of view, it has a lot of explanatory power, because that kid's lived lives in the past and they've made decisions and cultivated certain attitudes. And so that kid is then different from another kid, and God's giving them a situation with the purpose of, elevating their consciousness or freeing them from certain bad mentalities they have or whatnot. And it's crafted to them based on attitudes they've cultivated from past lives, which need to be dealt with. And the other problem with not having reincarnation is, it's hard to say God's all loving if he only gives us a very small window of opportunity to attain his mercy. Like I've made a video on this subject, how I talked about religious exclusivism. I said I was debunking religious exclusivism, made a case for inclusivism based on the premise that God's all loving. So if you accept that God's all loving, then you have to accept that then it would only make sense that God would give us unlimited opportunities to get our act together and return to him. One really nice analogy which is used to explain this concept is that so we made a decision to turn our back on God and be rebellious. Like we wanted to be famous ourselves, because in the spiritual world, all the attention's on God. And that's lovely because God deserves all that attention, and we get to have attention from God. But everyone's focused on God. They're not focused on us. So if we have this little desire that we want to be special, then we have to go to a dark place because our specialness is not very bright. We're just tiny sparks of the divine. So we come to the material world and get given our own little apartment where we can have our 15 minutes of fame. And that's compared to a child that doesn't want to play with his father anymore. He wants to go to the park and play with his friends. So the loving father picks up his child, takes him to the park, and sits on the park bench and watches him that entire time, waiting for that time when the child says, "Daddy, I want to go home now." And the moment we make that decision that we want to go and be with God again, then God starts making arrangements to take us back. And that's a really that, that makes God very happy, just like it makes the father very happy when the child wants to be with him. And the father picks up the child and carries him home.
Okay. But it seems to me that your belief in God is something that is very basic for you and something that in a way you never questioned. But in terms of being, because you were formerly a Christian and you found philosophical problems, and I could present a lot of philosophical problems when it comes to reincarnation and Christian consciousness itself. So why not just drop the whole concept and wait for something solid?
Well, you say you could present problems, but I don't see problems. We could talk about that. I'd be happy to go through the problems, but I find the theology of Krishna consciousness to be unbelievably satisfying in its ability to explain.
Okay, but in terms of the problems, I think the one problem is that you have to actually prove that God exists before you believe in Him, right?
Well, proof for different subjects is different according to the subject. So, like when they proved the Big Bang, they used different methods for establishing the Big Bang theory than they use for figuring out if a particular drug gives a medical benefit without unwarranted side effects. So for different types of knowledge claims, there's different types of evidence. Like if you want to tell me you have a headache, I pretty much have to take your word for it. I can't, enter your body and experience your headache. It's not an ability that I have. So for proving God's existence, it's like there's this idea that like epistemological imperialism, which basically means epistemic bullying, where the sort of skeptical scientific Western idea that everything needs to have empirical evidence is used to beat up every other type of knowledge domain. So it's like, well, you don't have any empirical evidence that God exists. But that's based on this idea that, well, first of all, you can't prove empirically that we should have empirical proof for everything. So it's a self-referentially incoherent idea. It's self-defeating.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but I'm not gonna debate with you in terms of whether God is real, because but I want to talk about, for example, what is the nature or ontology of the God that you believe in?
I'll just finish that idea quickly. So what I was getting to is proof for God is personal. So we have, just like I have personal experience, which tells me this material world is real. The quality of my experience proves itself to me. And the quality of my interactions with other people proves that other people are conscious to me. In a similar way, my interactions with the cosmos, let's say, proves to me that the cosmos is conscious, and that consciousness is God.
It's sort of a panpsychism.
No,
I
it's
guess.
not panpsychism. I was just drawing an analogy from the body of another person to the universe. So panpsychism, we see that there's a material energy, and then like it's described in the Bhagavatam that the universe is the body of God, but it's a temporary body. God has a body in the spiritual world, but a spiritual body. But like God is the soul of the universe in a sense. He animates it. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's panpsychism.
Okay, so it's more of a panan theism, I guess, that there's a God, a spiritual form of God, but he also manifests in or animates the physical universe.
Yeah, well, everything's working on, like, ultimately everything's God's energy. Like even we're part of God's energy. It's just we have this doctrine called Achintya Beta Beta Tattva, which is simultaneous oneness and difference. So like we're one with God in a sense, like we have similar qualities to him. We're made out of the same substance as him, but we're different from him in quantity. So there's ways in which there's oneness and there's ways in which there's difference. It's a really beautiful synergy of a synthesis of two different conflicting theologies, which go back through Indian history of, monism, that everything's one, and Dvaitism, that there's two separate things, like us and God are separate. And you get the same debate in pretty much every world religion.
Okay, but so in a way you set yourself apart from the monistic religions, I guess, or is that right?
Yeah, we really go after monism. the idea that there's only one thing, or impersonalism, the idea that that all this sort of variety that we see in the material world is just an illusion, and actually at the deepest level, reality is I've been calling it lately a warm, fuzzy light. This is an idea that's common in India. It's kind of like Buddhism. They call it nirvana, the idea that the absolute truth is, there's a few Sanskrit words for it. There's nirvishesha and shunyavad. Shunya means nothing. So the worldview that there's nothing at ultimately end of it, or it's also called mayavad. Nirvishesha also is another way of saying nothing. So we really go after those worldviews because they take away the personal aspect, and they're also hard on the heart. A lot of the practitioners of those religious paths do a lot of austerity, which makes the heart grow hard. And we think the idea of devotion to God and variety in the spiritual world and personalism, and at the highest level, there's personalities having relationships, is an essential and really important element of religious practice.
Okay, but in terms of that, do you believe in the classical theory of God? They're like omnipresence, omnipotence.
Yeah, we believe in that. We've actually got 6. I usually can only remember 5 of them. Let's see how I go. Basically, the word Bhagavan in Sanskrit, it's basically the most basic word for God. It means full of all opulences. So there's 6 opulences. So he's got all beauty, all fame, all strength, all renunciation, all riches, and there's one more. I'll just pull it up. I should memorize them properly. 6 opulences of Lord Krishna. Beauty, knowledge, strength, wealth, fame, and renunciation. So he's the most beautiful. He's got the most knowledge, which would be omniscience. He's the strongest, which I guess would be omnipotence. He's the richest, the most famous, and even renunciation, which you wouldn't normally think of it as an opulence, but it is actually an opulence because, like imagine somebody's got a fancy car outside and it just gets one little scratch on it and they go out of their mind. That shows that they're controlled by their wealth. And so, whereas to be detached and have renunciation and be able to just not care and to go without is another kind of opulence.
Okay, but in terms of being a Christian consciousness, how do you view the Bible or the New Testament or Jesus?
So we accept Jesus as a great prophet who gave a wonderful message of love of God, and a lot of quotes from Jesus and like the core essence of what he taught, we totally accept and see it in line with our teachings. Of course, we put a different spin on it than a Christian would, but I don't think it's much of a stretch to interpret it in ways which are consistent with Krishna consciousness. But I mean, there is a lot of stuff in the Bible that doesn't seem that God conscious, like all the stuff that the atheists go after it for, like, the slavery and stuff. So I really wonder how much of it is divinely inspired and how much of it is people editing in things that enable them to justify what they were already doing, and, crafting a theology that, basically from their own human minds. Like one scholar in our movement really goes after Paul, that like he was and Augustine. Augustine and Paul are basically the fathers, the architects of Christian theology. And both of them are questionable because Paul was, before he became a Christian, murdering people because he didn't like their religious belief. And I mean, but there's not many of those people around today, thank God. But you'd think that if there's somebody who's prepared to kill somebody just because they don't like their religion, that even if that person reforms, you don't really want them coming up with the architecting the doctrine, right? Like, if somebody's has a criminal background, you don't put them in charge of the treasury, right? So if somebody's got a history of being a religious fanatic, then maybe if they craft the religious doctrine, then you'll get a fanatical religion, which unsurprisingly, the theology that Paul crafted resulted in hundreds of years of violence caused by Christians. And Augustine, he was for 10 years of his adult life a Manichaean. And the Manichaeanism is a really dark religious system where they see that God's evil and he wants us to suffer. And I haven't studied it much, but basically it's a really bizarre belief. And he carried some of that with him into Christianity, which is perhaps...
Yeah, I have a question before we continue on that. Because Christian consciousness is based on a lot of Hinduistic belief systems, right? So in that case, would you say that a lot of Hindu beliefs also caused violence and suffering in history?
Well, historically, that hasn't been the case. In recent years, it would appear that that's the case. But as soon as you go back prior to the Mughal invasion, which was the group of Muslims that invaded 700, 800, 900 years ago, something, there was 700 years of Muslim rule in India. So prior to the Mughal invasion, there was not a single religious war. There was no cultural genocides, nothing. So this is the reason why today in India, practically you go from one village to the next and they have a different language and a different culture, because they were a culturally plural society and they just didn't persecute each other over religious beliefs. So, I mean, there's that, and then there's this modern thing called the caste system, which is actually a degraded interpretation of the varnashram system. And the varnashram system was actually just a way of classifying people based on their psychophysical nature into different job categories. There's 4 job categories: the artists who do skilled work with their hands, make and create beauty; the Vaishyas who do business, mercantile stuff, and produce wealth. So the highest class of Vaishya were farmers growing food. That's the best way to produce wealth for society. And then there were the Kshatriyas, who were the rulers, and the king was the first person fighting in the battle. If there was ever a war, the king was the one charging, leading the charge in the battlefield. Which I think if we did that today, we wouldn't have so many crazy wars. Imagine if Donald Trump had to be the one fighting the war. I don't think he'd be starting so many wars. Or, George Bush, who started a lot of wars. But that's another point. And then there's the Brahmins, who were the intellectual class, and they engage in ideas. So when you break up, when you figure out what someone's like, the psychophysical nature wasn't supposed to be by birth, but today in the degraded version, it's considered to be based on birth. So my father was a Brahmin, therefore I'm a Brahmin. But in Vedic culture, they had this word, Brahma Bandhu, which meant you're a friend of a Brahmin. So it was kind of an insult, but it's a way of saying, you're born into a Brahmin family, but you're not actually a Brahmin. And it was actually based on qualities, not on birth. So today in the degraded version, it's based on birth, and they use it to discriminate against the other classes, because the Brahmin's supposed to be the highest. But really, when it's followed properly, it doesn't create that kind of divisiveness. It creates a really cohesive society, which we don't have today. Today, people go to school for 20 years and don't know what their psychophysical nature is and don't know what they want to do for a career. And then people get into a career that doesn't suit their psychophysical nature, which is a disaster in many cases. Like if someone's got a businessman nature and they're doing work in the field of ideas, they'll just try to monetize all the ideas. Or, if someone's in the field of ideas and they're working in government, that they won't be able to make decisions quickly enough, because ideas people spend a long time thinking and they can't make decisions fast enough. And basically, there's just lots of ways where if you have a particular psychophysical nature and you're working in the wrong type of career, it's bad for society and it's bad for you. So, going back to your question, the Vedas, when followed properly, do not create violence or poverty or discrimination. When something's not followed properly, like Jesus said, the letter without the spirit kills. So anything that has great power for good also has great power for evil, or a little bit of knowledge is dangerous. So if you take a religious theology and don't follow it properly, that's a disaster. It's like, you can give a practical example. Imagine if I started giving advice on how to invest in the stock market and got all these people following me, betting on the stock market based on what I was telling them. I don't know how to invest in the stock market. I don't know how to time the market. I don't know what stocks to buy. So a whole lot of people would go broke just because some idiot like me, who didn't have the knowledge that I claimed to have, put out my shingle and got people to listen to me. Whereas if somebody who knows what they're doing, gives advice and people follow that, then they can make a lot of money. So it's a similar way with religious teachings. If you get them wrong, you can mislead a lot of people and really mess up society. Like not just like make people miss out on salvation in this lifetime. You can really create havoc in society and have like the kind of religious wars that we've been seeing for the last 2,000 years.
Okay. I want to ask then because being a Hare Krishna, you prioritize religious inclusiveness, right? So how I have two questions on that. First, how would you include the Islamic religion in that? And second, how would you, for example, establish a bridge between those religions who were simply created out of deception or to make money out of people?
I think there's very few popular religions that don't have a genuine origin. I mean, like there's some modern ones like I really don't know what to make of Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses or so on. Or I mean, Scientology is probably the worst example. Like it's just nuts. But as far as like the major monotheisms like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, we see them as having a genuine beginning with real prophets and having many prophets through their history who had genuine spiritual realization and a real advanced relationship with God. But we see them as having a different caliber of teaching. So, Krishna came and spoke Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, who was like incredibly qualified. So the teachings that Krishna was able to impart to Arjuna were of a high caliber. And Lord Chaitanya came 500 years ago and spoke to the six Goswamis, who are considered to be some of the greatest scholars and intellectuals of Indian history, particularly, definitely of their time, like Rupa Goswami and Jiva Goswami are considered to be intellectual giants of their time. The amount of literature they wrote is phenomenal. And that's all composed in Sanskrit, which is a very complex language to work with. High caliber teachings, whereas Jesus came and his followers were basically farmers and peasants in the Middle East, which wasn't at the time such an advanced culture. And in a similar way, Muhammad himself wasn't that special. He got given this service of delivering this message. If the lecture is given and part of the lecture is, just basic things about hygiene, it's like, okay, well, the people must have needed to hear that. There must have be a low quality audience. So in the Quran and the Bible, you get statements like, don't sleep with your mother and so on, which suggests that the people at the time were doing those things and needed to be told not to do that. Whereas in Bhagavad Gita, you don't get that. You just get a very high level spiritual knowledge. So as far as people practicing those religions, I think Krishna, those religions can obviously connect people with God to some extent, and a sincere practitioner can get guidance from within the heart by God to take them further. So like you get many of the Christian saints went vegetarian because I guess they came to a certain level of realizations where they felt that they couldn't participate in the violence perpetrated to animals just to satisfy their tongues or to feed their belly.
Okay. This is what I think. But you could correct me if I'm wrong. I don't really know much about being a Hare Krishna, but it seems that the Christian consciousness is a response to the analytical philosophy that is applied to monotheistic religions. So, in a way, Hinduism decided to adapt and be part of these religions that have liberal values and create in a way a very inclusive a form of belief system, you know. But that's what I think, because in actuality, when you look at India, you know, and its pluralistic religions, it doesn't seem to be as developed as what the Hare Krishna present Eastern philosophy or Eastern religions to be. And with all the yeah, I was saying that if you look at the Eastern religions in, like for example, India, they have rituals and practices that seem barbaric still, and are obviously culturally developed as a Christian would call pagan or whatnot. And this is something that I think is, I don't know, you could correct me.
Well, yeah, you definitely get barbaric stuff going on in India today, for sure. But like I was saying before, with the sort of religious tolerance in India, you know, if the Christians hadn't gone around killing people, you would have had Christianity growing up alongside all sorts of varieties of pagan worldviews also. So in India, you have those things there alongside the bona fide monotheistic theology, just because they didn't go around exterminating people for having a different belief. But I mean, when you say you think Krishna consciousness is a response to a sort of analytics of the West, what sort of timeline would you give to that?
Well, I think that, for example, in terms of who the founder of Hare Krishna is, you can see actually when the theology of, or the philosophy actually began or appeared. And this sort of philosophy never existed before.
So Prabhupada, he didn't actually offer a new theology or change anything. Everything he taught is fully consistent with what his guru taught, which is Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur goes back to his guru, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And by then we go back that far, we're in the early 1800s. So is that far enough back to not work for your theory? How far do we have to go back before your theory falls over?
1800s is still a little recent, you know, but I think that, for example, when you compare it to the age of Christian theology, like for reaching from the Middle Ages to the medieval times.
Yeah, so Bhaktivinoda Thakur was actually a Christian at one point, and he changed to Krishna consciousness, but he had quite an inclusivist worldview, and he wrote a lot about Christianity and different worldviews. So perhaps you could make that argument about him. But he was studying the teachings of the six Goswamis, which is 500 years ago. So now we're in 15th century in West Bengal, and there wasn't Christianity on the scene then. And then ultimately, our core scripture is Bhagavad Gita. And in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna himself is speaking this kind of inclusivism. Krishna doesn't give anything like fanatical religion or exclusivist religion in Bhagavad Gita. He gives principle-based. So he describes it almost like you might hear psychology explained, like psychological principles, like, you know, this kind of thing leads to depression, this kind of thing leads to happiness, this kind of thing leads to an even deeper kind of satisfaction, which cannot accurately be called happiness. Like, you know, like someone who really knows psychology might say, well, you can make that decision, but if you go down that road, this will be the consequence. And so that's basically the way Krishna speaks, the way a good counselor or psychologist might coach somebody and say, well, you can make your own decision, but this will happen. So Krishna speaks Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna. At the end, he says, you know, I've given you all this knowledge. Now you make your decision. And throughout it, he's saying, you know, people who worship the demigods go to the demigods. People who worship the ancestors go to the ancestors, and so on. And, you know, ultimately people who worship me go to me. So there's so many other points he makes where it's not once does he say, you know, you have to go to a Krishna church and you have to pledge your life to Krishna. He's saying me a lot, but you examine philosophically, and me in that sense means God. Like Bhagavan is another word for God. Allah is the Arabic word for God, and there's Christian names for God, and it's all through the core scriptures that there's a variety of names for God. And
what does Hare Krishna mean, by the way?
Oh, the name Krishna in English means the all attractive one. It also means black, because Krishna is described as having a blackish or like a complexion like a dark rain cloud. But the real meaning is attractive. So we chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. That's our core meditation. We chant it as japa, sort of like muttering it to ourselves. And like a meditation where we're just meditating on the mantra. And we also do it in kirtan, which is congregational chanting, where we have drums and kartals and we all sing in a group, call and response. And the word Rama also means the source of all pleasure, and that's another name for Krishna.
Mm-hmm. What about Hare? What does that mean?
Hare is from Hara. It's the vocative form. It's the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, which I just gave, is in the vocative form, which is quite unusual for Sanskrit mantras. Usually they're in the like Namo Namaha, like I offer my obeisances to, is the grammatical form of Namo Namaha. Whereas Hare Krishna is in the vocative, which means calling out to. So it's like, hey, Krishna. It's like directly addressing God. And so Hare is the vocative of Hara, which is the you could call it a divine female energy. So Krishna's got his, like the mother Hara. Krishna's got his consort Radharani, who also expands from there into various other Shaktis and personalities. But the original form is like the divine original mother Hara. So there's the two there, Krishna and his consort. And they're both there in the mantra. So we're calling out to the divine mother and to...
Okay, and I want to ask, like, in terms of behavioral philosophy, what does being a Hare Krishna teach you as an individual, and how you should act in your daily life, your thought process?
So, like, one verse in Bhagavatam, which is our expanded main scripture, it's described as the graduate study to Bhagavad Gita. One verse in there says, Anta Narayana Smriti, which means the goal of life is to remember Vishnu at the time of death. And that's the whole process of how we live our lives now, that we try to fix our mind on God. So there's one famous verse in Bhagavad Gita where Krishna uses the word me like 6 times. Where, it says, always think of me, offer your love to me, and you'll come to me, and so on. So it's good that I like how you put it in a psychological frame, because that you could call it yoga psychology. So one common argument for the existence of the soul that we use is that, if the soul didn't exist and we were just material bodies, then you fill your belly, you satisfy all your senses and you should be happy, right? But it doesn't work like that. You get all these famous people, like Muhammad Ali was one of them, and so many of them, George Harrison. I think George Harrison had a guru in India tell him that you're very lucky. Most people spend their whole life trying to climb the wall. You're very lucky to have gotten on top of the wall at a young age to figure out that there's nothing there. Because George Harrison, we had fame and wealth beyond anything we could ever dream of attaining, and he wasn't satisfied. So this proves that we're not our bodies, that there's something else there, so that we have a soul. And, just like where there's thirst, there's water, we have hunger and food exists. So many desires we have, there's something that exists which can satisfy them. So similarly, we've got a God-shaped hole in our heart. And, like you can have a sports car and you shine the wheels and you put petrol in the tank and you get it serviced and you do all these things, but you don't feed the driver, and you're driving around and you're hungry and you're thinking, why aren't I satisfied? Maybe I'll put some more fuel in the car. So we do this, we have this hole in our heart and we think, I'm not satisfied. Oh, no, I'll eat some more. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, I'm not satisfied. Oh, I'll break up with this person and start a relationship with someone else. Oh, that didn't work. I'll do it again. And we, people go on like this, adjusting so many different things. That one analogy for it is you're carrying this heavy log and you're thinking, oh, this is so painful. It's giving me so much grief carrying this heavy log. And then you come up with this genius idea. You shift it from carrying it with your arms to carrying it on your shoulder. and you get this great sensation of relief. You think, oh, that's so much better. Those muscles that were under strain now aren't under strain anymore. I can relax. And you're walking along, before you know it, you start aching again. So in a similar way, I think in psychology, they call it a dopamine adaptation curve, where whatever level of dopamine stimulation you expose yourself to, your brain just gets used to it, and that becomes the baseline. And you constantly have to increase it in order to become satisfied. So our theology teaches that you need to some extent, restrict engaging in that kind of dopamine-driven activity, which ultimately just leaves you unsatisfied, and instead take satisfaction from hearing about God, chanting God's names, and telling other people about God, and basically just connecting with God and thinking about God. And when we do that, we become satisfied on a deeper level. And I mean, it's another way I like to argue Pascal's wager, which is like, hey, even if this isn't true, this is a good life. I'm way more satisfied and way more happy than I ever could have been going out into the material world trying to fill my tank with sense gratification. Like, that's just a really hollow existence.
Yeah, and I just want to say that, bro, this has been a great conversation, and I've never talked to someone from the Hare Krishna religion before, or belief system, and it's been really interesting. And I just want to ask you two last questions to end this, because the first question is that if there's any misunderstanding or misinterpretation of what the Hare Krishna believe, or that a bad view from other people that view it as something a paganistic or cult, what would you tell them? And secondly, being someone who has known this truth, and you know that this gives you a good life, what would you do to make this world a better place?
There's a lot in there. The common misconceptions, there would be a few of them. One of them would be the caste system, which I already addressed. Another would be that we're a fanatical cult. And I mean, to give the devil his due, there has been a lot of fanaticism going on in the Hare Krishna movement over the years. It was kind of a Vedic Lord of the Flies at one point. But a lot of us have grown and become more mature. And, you can't judge God, shouldn't judge a theology by the people who aren't following it properly. The Vedic Lord of the Flies thing, just to cover that point again, we as with any religion, you get people who don't represent the religion very well and aren't following it, and as with all of them, those people don't represent the tradition. So for the misconception that we're fanatical, I'd say those people don't represent our tradition, and that's not what I joined for. And I know a lot of people that are not like that. So that's the answer for that. And then I think I moved on to the misconception of that we're pantheistic. So I can see why people would think that, because we talk about Vishnu and Ganesh and Shiva and so many different personalities which have all these mystical powers. But we're very explicit that all those personalities are second to the Vishnu Tattva personalities, of which there's many of, but they're ultimately just different expressions or different manifestations of the same person. So we've got different personalities. I go to work and I express one side of my personality, and I come home and I play with my baby and I express another feature of my personality, play with my 4-year-old, and it's another, and interact with my wife, and it's a different feature of my personality. So in a similar way, God's got different features of his personalities for interacting with all his myriad of devotees, and he's got different forms that he takes for those different personalities. He's got a number of forms. And, when I want to express a different part of my personality, I have to walk from the office to the car, drive home, whereas God can do them all simultaneously. So it's not actually pantheism, it's monotheism. It's just more complicated than other theologies. We've got more detail about God. What were your other questions?
Yeah, so how would you make the world a better place, knowing the truth that you have right now?
Well, we would make the world a better place by giving people a kind of happiness that reduces greed. So what is it? There's enough in the world for everybody's need, but not enough for everybody's greed. Or one of our great acharyas, what we call prophet, Bhakti Siddhanta, said that there's no scarcity in this world. The only scarcity is of Krishna consciousness, which is just another way of saying of love of God. So, if there's Christians that are having genuine connections with God and Muslims that are having genuine connections with God and so on, that counts to us as Krishna consciousness, because when we say Krishna, we just mean God. So if people are being God conscious and dedicating their lives to loving God, then that, even if they're not in our religion, that serves the same psychological purpose in society of reducing greed. And like a lot of people comment, I can't remember the name of the one I was listening to, but it's about how we make the world a better place by removing greed and providing a kind of deeper satisfaction, which means people don't have to try to chase satisfaction in ways that won't actually provide it. And this will, first of all, people will be happier because they'll actually have their needs met rather than trying to feed. It's like if you're hungry and all you do is eat Oreos and potato chips, you'll end up feeling sick and you'll still be hungry because you won't have got the nourishment you need. Whereas by adding God consciousness into your life, you actually get the need of the soul met and it becomes satisfying. Even, if you want to be totally skeptical and say, well, we can't know any of this stuff's true, it's still, we can measure psychologically the results. There's one famous psychologist who said that theism is psychology's best kept secret. So it's pretty clear that a religious community and a belief in God is satisfying